Welcome. So our speaker this evening is no stranger to the Society of Army Historical Research. He's done a number of talks for us in the past. He is a co-producer of the Napoleonic podcast, and I've put a link to the show at the top of the chat box for those who perhaps have not been exposed to this in the past. He and Zach White run it, and although it's not my period of history, it is an interesting podcast to listen to, particularly in the recent past where Spotify have decided to play around with their back catalogue, is what I should probably say. Anyway, our speaker this evening is a professor at the University of Connecticut, and more interesting for me, he's a competitive powerlifter in the 100 kilogram weight class, and I can't believe it. He's in the Masters. He's over 40. I don't see that when I look at the man on my screen. But without any more to say from me, I'm going to ask Luke Reynolds to take the stage. I will leave and then I'll come back and I will run the Q&A session. So Luke, over to you.
Thank you, Dudley, and thank you all for coming tonight, and happy Christmas or happy holidays to all of you in advance. It's always a pleasure to talk here at the Society for Army Historical Research. As Dudley said, I've done a few of these, and I was also involved in the Centenary Conference, which was a lot of fun. So this is going to be a little all over the place. It's about some of my current research, and it sort of jumps around a little bit, but hopefully it will be entertaining and enlightening in one way or another. So, all right, marching the boards, theatrical representations of the army in 19th century Britain. In the late summer of 1815, when the battlefield of Waterloo was still littered with the detritus of war, the Lord Chamberlain's licensor of plays refused, without explanation, to allow a new dramatic anecdote entitled The Duke's Coat, or The Night After Waterloo, to be performed at the Theatre Royal Lyceum. In the advertisement that accompanied the publication of the script, the unnamed author expressed surprise that the licensor took offense to this, quote, mere trifle, admitting that the quality is not the best, but that quality was never been the priority of the Lord Chamberlain before this. The two potential explanations that the author posits are either that the licensor took offense at how soon after the battle, where casualties totaled over 50,000, such a comic anecdote would be staged, or that it seemed in poor taste to portray the Duke of Wellington on the stage. The author, who is clearly someone used to justifying their creative output, points out an exculpation that while it would seem in poor taste to display carnage from a battle where the wounded were still recovering, surely, and this is a quote, there can be no indecorum in omitting all such details. And while the Duke of Wellington is mentioned, neither the Duke nor even the Duke's coat, despite the title, are at all introduced. Neither plea held any traction with the licensor of plays, and the Duke's Coat was condemned for nearly a decade to the ever-growing pile of plays written but never performed. Then in May of 1824, it was plucked from obscurity by Davis's Royal Amphitheatre, better known to most of you here as Astley's Royal Amphitheatre, who used it with no recorded objection from the Lord Chamberlain's office to introduce a new ballet. The author's admission that his work was not only a mere trifle, but also perhaps a dull one, and that is another direct quote, was borne out by the fact that it only graced the amphitheater's stage for a week before being replaced by a comic burletta called The Secret that ran for 4 times its length. But it is still intriguing that the popular taste had changed enough in 9 years that the Duke's Coat went from banned to produced with very little fanfare. The credit for part of that shift must be laid at the footlights of the hippodramatic spectacle that preceded the Duke's Coat on the amphitheater stage, J.H. Amherst's The Battle of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo was everything the Duke's Coat was not. It filled the stage with combat, featured depictions not just of Wellington, but also of Napoleon, Blücher, Brunswick, and several of their commanders, and crucially, was a smash hit. Let us therefore discuss these two theatrical productions in a little bit more detail to explore why one resonated with the British public so much more than the other. The Duke's Coat is a one-act farce with multiple musical interludes based around the trope of mistaken identity. Indeed, across the play's 4 scenes, 2 men are mistaken for Wellington, 1 for Napoleon, and a French marshal is assumed to be a British officer. The play is set in and around the Inn of La Belle Alliance on the night of the 18th of June and the early morning of the 19th, with the innkeeper and his family, as well as representatives of both the Allied and French armies, coming to terms with the results of the battle as well as its destruction. The play is extremely patriotic in tone, and when I say patriotic, I mean patriotic from the British point of view. The French are depicted as despoilers who leave everything a wreck behind them, while Wellington is described, as the savior of Europe. Early in the second scene, Mr. Simmerkin, a former corporal in the Austrian army turned landlord of La Belle Alliance, stands with his family in the wreckage of his inn. The windows and door are broken and missing, and, quote, the furniture much broken and scattered, end quote. And using wine that the French troops unaccountably left undisturbed, he toasts the great English Duke. And I quote again, "I will give you a soldier's grace, the health of our deliverer, his grace of Wellington. He is what an honest man may call a hero. Your emperors and marshals fight to put crowns on their heads and crowns in their pockets. He fights like a man of honor, to do right and to punish wrong." Simmerkin is horrified to hear that he has recently missed Wellington's legendary meeting with Blucher outside of his inn, but is nonetheless quick to correct his daughter when she claims he is dressed in a modest blue coat instead of a fine embroidered scarlet coat with such buttonholes and shoulder knots as befits an English field marshal. It is from that assumption that the main series of mistaken identities arise. For when one of Wellington's aides-de-camp arrive, dressed in traditional English red and sporting the star of the commander of the Order of the Bath, the Simmerkins automatically assume it is Wellington himself, touring the battlefield incognito. That assumption is then passed on to a wounded French marshal, who tasks his 4 remaining soldiers to capture, quote-unquote, the Duke. Even by the standards of 1815 British propaganda, the marshal is depicted ruthlessly. He is completely uncaring of the losses his men have suffered and only concerned with his own well-being. For example, he sports a cockade that is tricolored on one side and royalist white on the other, so he can switch Frances at will. He is looking to redeem his reputation following his defection to Bonaparte, and sees Wellington as his path to safety. In the end, the marshal is stymied twice. Not only do his soldiers attempt to capture the wrong man, they mistake Simmerkin trying on the ADC's coat for the Duke, but their attempt is thwarted by the intervention of the ADC and then 4 British dragoons, the 5 of whom together act as the play's deus ex machina, even to the point of solving the innkeeper's daughter's romantic quandary. Given the propagandistic nature of the piece, it is unsurprising that the aide-de-camp is depicted as the model of a British gentleman and soldier. He is polite and considerate to the Simmerkins, cares for his horse, is attentive to his duty, supports the cause of true love, only drinks moderately, never appears without a coat on. When Simmerkin dons his, he appears in one of the landlords so that he doesn't offend the young ladies by showing shirt sleeves. And when danger threatens, leaps into combat against 4 men without hesitation. He regards the deference with which he is treated by the Simmerkins with bemusement and assumes that they treat him that way, quote, because all Englishmen are lords with these people, a popular late 19th and early 20th century trope that I had actually never encountered this early. Overall, the Duke's Coat is indeed a quote-unquote mere trifle. It is poorly written, heavily reliant on tropes that everyone from Shakespeare to Sheridan had already done better, and is so heavy-handed that even an audience drunk on victory in September of 1815 would probably have regarded it with skepticism. But it is odd that it was interdicted or interceded at the time when other, worse plays and more blatant patriotic spectacles were allowed. If it was indeed because of either of the issues posited by its author, it was a break from policy. There had been theatrical depictions of both Talavera and Salamanca staged within a month of the battle themselves, and representatives of Victoria and Trafalgar had only been slightly slower off the mark, and all of those featured more violence and more depictions of the actual battlefield than the Duke's Coat did. Most of these spectacles were inherently disposable. designed to be put on in the first flush of patriotic fervor and then forgotten. And as such, sadly, their scripts have been lost to time. Indeed, it was only the spite of the Duke's coat's spurned author driving him to publish his work that preserved it in the first place. That is emphatically not the case for Amherst's Battle of Waterloo, under whose protective aegis the Duke's coat was finally performed in 1824. The second most popular hippodrama ever performed at the Royal Amphitheatre, the Battle of Waterloo was the most successful Napoleonic spectacle and arguably the most successful military spectacle in 19th century Britain. It was a new type of integrated hippodrama that blended equestrian action and theatrical performance in a way that advanced the story, forging the two into a single narrative. It occupies a similar place in the technical history of British hippodrama to the one held by Showboat in American musical theater. However, where Showboat matched its groundbreaking performance style with an equally critical stance against the cultural mores of the time, most particularly those to do with race, the Battle of Waterloo contributions to British theater was only possible because it conformed to the average Briton's understanding of the battle. Unlike Showboat, which thanks to the Great Depression would have to wait years to see its style imitated, that the Battle of Waterloo changed the hippodramatic game was immediately obvious in theatrical circles. Its new style, and sometimes its subject matter, were soon being imitated by other troupes across the country. The show is divided into the standard 3 acts, each ending with a battle scene. The first of these was the bridge at Marchiennes, from which the advancing French evicted the Prussians on the 15th of June on their way towards Brussels. The second was the crossroads at Quatre Bras, south of Waterloo, which the Allied army held against the French on June 16th, but which prevented Wellington from coming to the aid of Blücher at Ligny. The final climax was set around Mont Saint-Jean, which stands in for most of the Allied line towards the close of the day on the 18th of June. And when I say that it stands in for that, if you read the script, you understand that there are bits of the action that are being depicted that happened on the extreme left of the Allied line, and there are bits that happened in the siege of Hougoumont and in the siege of La Haye-Saint. So it's basically all of them mashed together into Mont Saint-Jean. The cast of characters were a mix of real and fictional. Napoleon, Wellington, and Blücher, along with a number of their generals, all appear. William Davis, then the owner and manager of the amphitheater that would be known to permanent history as Astley's, but for that 1 year, because he was the owner, is known as Davis's, played General Roland Viscount Hill, one of Wellington's most trusted generals. Andrew Ducrot, the equestrian star of the amphitheater and equestrian choreographer, took one of the most dramatic and challenging equestrian roles, the Duke of Brunswick, whose death on horseback while leading a charge of his Brunswick Ducal Field Corps, commonly known as the Black Brunswickers, at the Battle of Waterloo, serves as one of the emotional climaxes of Act 2. It's also one of the most difficult performances that he ever attempted. This man literally died on horseback every night and fell from a galloping horse safely. It is a role that he accomplished hundreds of times safely, but that others have attempted and seriously injured themselves in the process. Wellington, not shot from horseback, crucially, was of course represented, although he speaks largely in patriotic quotations. Some of them are clearly inspired by the sayings and writings of the actual Duke, but he also borrows from Nelson and other notable British figures. There is a speech that he gives that is quite literally a copy and paste, but with words changed to prevent plagiarism, of England expects every man to do his duty. On the fictional side, the playwright Amherst, more comfortable on the boards than on a horse, took the stage as Monsieur Maladroit, the half-French comic relief who ensures that he speaks the language of every army engaged in the battle, so he can claim protection from any of them. The heroic rank and file of the British Army were represented by Bob, a veteran private who bears a battlefield wound with fortitude and pragmatism and remains determined to serve his regiment and army despite his crutch, and Standfast, a wonderful case of nominative determinism, a corporal in the Highlanders who has all the characteristics of the ideal soldier. He rescues children in the midst of the battle, stays true on campaign to his sweetheart Mary, who unbeknownst to him has followed him to the war disguised as a soldier, and when he is captured, behaves with such dignity and assured patriotism that Napoleon himself declares him a brave and honorable man and frees him from captivity. This is, on the left-hand side of your screen, what the amphitheater looked like. If you want to imagine it, its stage was effectively the Greek omega symbol. It was a round circus arena with a full-on traditional theatrical stage attached to it. The orchestra was in between, but boards could be laid across to transfer people from one side to the other. The Battle of Waterloo's status as a blockbuster rested on its ability to mix the new and old. It used this new style of integrated action built on familiar character tropes, so the new and the old. There are a few other aspects of the production's characters, designs, and narrative that are worth highlighting. It is unsurprisingly deeply patriotic, with multiple reminders of Britain and Wellington's track record in the war, and they are depicted in the traditional noble stances. So, for example, here we have details of the Duke of Wellington on the left. The top ones are from West's characters and drawings from the Battle of Waterloo, which was published in 1824. The bottom are colored plates from Pollock's characters and scenes in the Battle of Waterloo, which was published throughout the 1850s and even into the 1950s. So on the left, we have Wellington on his charger. In the middle, we have Standfast, who in the middle of the 19th century went from the more old school version of a Highlander to the traditional kilted variety. And on the right, we have a lifeguard seizing a French eagle in combat with a French soldier. It is... all right, where was I? Yes. British behavior on and off the battlefield was praised. Some of the praise was reasonably legitimate. Under Wellington, the British Army was relatively restrained in their handling of enemy civilians, for example, the storming of cities and fortresses notwithstanding. But the idea that Britain provided good Chelsea quarters for every disabled soldier would have come as news to the thousands of wounded veterans forced to take any job they could, or even resort to begging to make ends meet. The Hippodrama was also on traditional ground with its praise of British unity. One of the main characters, Molly Maloney, is an Irish woman who repeatedly emphasizes that as long as England, Scotland, and Ireland stand united, Wales is sadly neglected. There is nothing they cannot overcome. She takes up arms multiple times throughout the plot and was played by a man in the traditional style of a pantomime dame. Seemed rather fitting given that we are sort of speaking at Christmas right now, and can be thought of as a drag version of Captains Gower, Fluellen, McMorris, and Jammy from Shakespeare's Henry V. Molly is a crucial part of the Hippodrama's nationalization of the battle and the wars. All three of the Battle of Waterloo's female leads. The Prussian noblewoman Fedora, who is the center of your screen, the camp follower Molly Maloney on the left, and the soldier's sweetheart turned illicit volunteer Mary Cameron on the right, don uniform at some point and take their place in the action. And I would just briefly like to pause here to highlight a change in the performance mores of the time. In the early version in 1824, Mary is depicted in traditional, the same uniform as her sweetheart, which includes tartan trousers. By about the middle of the 19th century, this was transferred into a kilt. It is the tradition of the Highland regiments, and usually as depicted, but what it also meant was that the average stagegoer got to see more of Mary's legs in a man's kilt than they normally would have in a woman's dress, thus adding to the sex appeal, bringing in more clients. Bums on seats love bums on seats. Fedora is the avatar of Prussian revenge and kills and wounds multiple French soldiers, including slaughtering wounded soldiers after the Battle of Quatre Bras. Mary is wounded at the Battle of Quatre Bras and while dressed as a Highlander, and Molly not only captures a French NCO and rescues Standfast, but is seen throughout the final battle scene firing her pistols. By acting in the conflict and accepting the risk, these avatars of British and Prussian womanhood extend the efforts and sacrifices of their countries in the war beyond their militaries. Through them, the cost and the victory all become shared by all. This is directly in line with the nationalization of Waterloo that Britain was undertaking at the time, and may have played some part in the Hippodrama's popularity with civilian audiences. In one way, however, the Battle of Waterloo was decidedly out of step with the rest of Britain in 1824. Alongside that nationalization of the battle was a determination to make Waterloo a purely British victory, only grudgingly, if at all, shared with their Dutch, Belgian, and Prussian allies. Given this, one would expect the Battle of Waterloo to concentrate exclusively on the British and the French, as in fact the Duke's coat did, the Austrian innkeeper and his family notwithstanding. Civilians are a different matter. But this is not the case. There is not a single British soldier in the first act of the Battle of Waterloo, which is dominated by the Prussians and then the French. Even when the British do appear, the Prussians continue to play a crucial role and are present for the climactic battles of both the second and third acts. Those of you who know your history will not blink at the fact that the Prussians were depicted as Waterloo, but may pause for a minute when you realize that they were also depicted at Quatre Bras. Other allies are treated well, especially the Black Brunswickers, and the only foreign regiment directly criticized is the Cumberland Hussars, a volunteer regiment who had, by 1824, become a byword for Allied incompetence. The hippodrama is also relatively generous to the French. Fedora constantly reminds the audience of the brutality of Napoleon's armies. But on stage, they generally behave with restraint, and Napoleon even personally assures a farmer that the civilian population have nothing to fear from a French victory. Napoleon is given more stage time than Wellington and Blucher combined, and is written as a generous and civilized gentleman with a razor-sharp understanding of propaganda. The Battle of Waterloo predates most of the British efforts to domesticate Napoleon, who had only been dead 3 years in 1824, and turn him into a romantic icon. It is unclear precisely what drove this generosity to Britain's allies and the Old Enemy, but it is possible that the international makeup and continental touring habits of Ducrot's company may have played a part. The Battle of Waterloo was a smash hit from the moment it debuted. A week after opening, its advertising claimed crowded houses every night and promised that the unprecedentedly magnificent spectacle would run until further notice. Within a month, the success caught the attention of London's papers. The Morning Post informed its readers on May 13th that the Battle of Waterloo and Monsieur Ducrot's equestrian feats at Davis's amphitheater continue to excite the attention of all classes. The curtain, they concluded, never rises without an overflow. Later that month, the Morning Post noted that the hippodrama continues eminently attractive, including a list of 27 titled individuals who had been spotted in attendance, including one legendary figure who decided to replant a forest by blasting tree seeds out of a cannon. The monthly magazine soon followed the daily papers. The London Magazine delightedly reported that the Battle of Waterloo is being fought over and over again here with as much fury as the genuine one, while the drama related that the Battle of Waterloo, together with the amazing horsemanship of Monsieur Ducrot, have drawn much fashionable and crowded audiences to this theater, that all thought of producing further novelty has for the present been laid aside. Perhaps surprisingly, given the Battle of Waterloo's balanced treatment of the Prussians and Allied efforts, but unquestionably much to the delight of the management, London's military circles agreed with its papers. The Duke of Wellington, the supreme avatar of British military thought and legacy, attended twice, paying marked attention to the representation of his most famous battle, and along with the Marquis of Anglesey, or Marquis of Anglesey, declared himself highly pleased with the mimic representations of that celebrated conflict, and was much gratified with the inimitable horsemanship of Monsieur Ducrot. It is not recorded what the Duke thought of the man who portrayed him in the battle, but given that he is on record in other events laughing heartily at his representative, he seems to have at least passed muster. Following the example of their commanders, other military men soon joined the throngs at the amphitheater. Benson Earl Hill, a former artillery officer who penned several memoirs, recorded in his collection of theatrical anecdotes that he attended anticipating, quote, much food for mirth, but was amazed at the accuracy with which the military evolutions were executed and urged other veterans to attend. The association between the military and the hippodrama was made semi-official at the pre-antepenultimate production of the 1824 season, when 700 children of the military asylum Chelsea, under the patronage of His Royal Highness the Duke of York, occupied a conspicuous situation in the amphitheater. The Morning Post informed its readers the next morning that the sight was extremely gratifying and made an extraordinary impression on the feelings of the audience, an impression that was reinforced when the beautiful little band belonging to the school joined the grand military tableau that ends the hippodrama to march and countermarch alongside the performers and offer a closing rendition of God Save the King. Even more significantly, given the often transient nature of patriotic spectacles, was the fact that the Battle of Waterloo, to use the theatrical term, had legs. It ran the entire length of the 1824 season, only closing in October after a remarkable 144 consecutive performances, having been seen by between 288,000 and 360,000 patrons over the course of its run. It was revived over a dozen times in the years following, the first time less than a year after it closed. The revivals often coincided with Waterloo anniversaries and was performed across Great Britain, in Ireland, and even on the eastern seaboard of the United States. Its tour of New York and Boston drew criticism from theatrical critics who blamed it for drawing business away from legitimate theater. Plus ça change, plus ça c'est même chose. Its more lasting legacy of depicting the British Army on the stage, however, was on a much smaller scale. Toy theater, or to give it its more common name in the 19th century, juvenile drama, was, like the hippodrama, a phenomenon with a mixed Anglo-French background. In Britain, it emerged out of the thriving print culture of the late Georgian era, where artists and publishers, striving to be on the cutting edge of patron demand, discovered that prints of actors in costume from current plays sold well. Inspired by children's lottery prints, which depicted 8 characters per sheet, each in their own box and rhyming caption, and were particularly popular at Christmas time, these portraits soon evolved into multiple character studies on one sheet, and then into all the characters, often with several depictions of the main characters in different costumes and poses. And the images that I have used of Standfast, The Combat, Wellington, Molly Maloney, Fedora, and Mary Cameron are all from these juvenile drama sheets. Across the Channel, in Paris, a group of theatrical agencies started producing visual representations of not only the actors in costume, but also the scenery as a guide to provincial and foreign theaters who were mounting productions of Parisian hits. It is unclear whether the London printmakers producing the character sheets were inspired by the French guide sheets, if they hit upon the idea themselves, or if they were bowing to demands of their clientele, but it was only a matter of time before they added scenery and then scripts, first to flesh out their theatrical souvenirs, and then to allow people to recreate their favorite productions in their nurseries and family rooms. The heyday of English juvenile drama ran from 1810 into the 1840s, and it enjoyed a long afterlife thanks to forming crucial childhood memories for many influential Victorians and Edwardians. G.K. Chesterton and Winston Churchill took on the role of theatrical impresarios in their youth, as did Charles Dickens, who called upon his memories of the ups and downs of a production in his 1850 short story, A Christmas Tree, while Robert Louis Stevenson held such an affinity for the pastime that he wrote a brief memoir singing its praises in 1882. As a result, many reproduction sets were still available well into the 20th century, including the colored versions of the Battle of Waterloo used in this talk. Juvenile drama contained full productions of popular plays, melodramas, and spectacles in miniature. In addition to all the characters, set pieces, and scenery, they came with script books and stage directions, and every publisher of the medium also produced and sold elaborately decorated proscenium arches, wings, and stages to complete the illusion. It is debatable, however, if even half the sets purchased ever saw their final form realized. Many served as theatrical souvenirs, purchased by patrons of all ages, just as many modern theater lovers collect and read scripts without any intention of mounting full-scale performances. They are usually the ones that have survived, as they were kept in better condition, and now serve as an invaluable sources for theatrical historians seeking a deeper, necessarily more visual and material knowledge of early 19th century British stage. Even sets purchased by or for the intended juvenile audiences were not guaranteed to tread the boards of their model theaters. A full production took a remarkable amount of work. John Oxenford, one of the leading theater critics of Victorian London, recalled that the preparation of a single play occupied, quote, all the spare hours of the winter holidays. So if anyone here has children and is looking to entertain them for the entirety of the Christmas break, may I draw your attention to these options. The figures had to be painted, unless one was rich enough to have purchased the pre-colored versions, a choice Stevenson dismissed as, quote, willfully foregoing pleasure, and then cut from their sheets, a labor of love given the number of characters that are depicted in dynamic poses with props held away from their bodies, as you can see on your screens. Your players then had to be glued to stiff cardboard, also precisely cut to shape, unless you wanted your hero with unreasonable disposition to become faint at the legs and double up at exciting points in the drama, and then attached to tin slides that allowed their movement across the stage. The script had to be read, stage directions parsed, and an audience corralled. It was also expensive. The canola oil or colza oil that fueled the footlights and the quote-unquote red fire, a chemical powder that when lit provided the special effects of explosions and fires, and despite its name came in all colors, that marked climactic scenes meant that a single production quite literally burned through an entire week's pocket money. It should not come as a surprise, therefore, that many more sets were purchased than productions mounted. If one reads the memoirs of those who engaged in the hobby as children, however, this fact is not presented as unfortunate and may have been part of the pleasure. Stevenson dismisses the actual performance of a piece of juvenile drama as a, quote, long-drawn disenchantment, while heaping praise on the artistic endeavor of painting, the characters and scenery, and above all, on how the potential of the plays and the character illustrations ignited the imagination. Stevenson may have been extreme in his views. He insisted that to cut the figures out was simply sacrilege. But he was far from alone in maintaining that the performance itself was the least important part of juvenile drama. William Archer, another theater critic of the second half of the 19th century, confessed in the Art Journal that he could not conceive why any human soul would find pleasure in pasteboard performances. But that was the point. And I quote again, "It is precisely because the performance never comes off that toy theater is so infinitely preferable to its so-called real rivals. Played melodramas are great, but those unplayed are greater. And by that standard, juvenile drama is the very gymnasium of the imagination." Why? After all that work of painting and potentially cutting out and mounting each individual character or scene, should a child shackle themselves to a script when they could simply let their imagination run rampant and, like Ivan Mazeppa, ride the careening stallion into legend? This abandonment of the script, or composition of their own, is in keeping with much of the modern scholarship on children and play and makes a great deal of sense. As adults, we are conditioned to view a play as a complete set, to be studied or performed as a single unit. But what, besides that script and conditioning, separates a juvenile drama from a themed set of paper dolls? This impulse may have been particularly strong for the Battle of Waterloo, where those paper dolls took on an additional allure as several companies of toy soldiers. To modern audiences, used to the fully three-dimensional pewter, tin, lead, or plastic toy soldiers of the late 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, the paper sheets of the Battle of Waterloo juvenile drama may not resemble the archetypical toy of imperial boyhood. But in the first half of the 19th century, toy soldiers were either flat tin figures, with their details provided by very slight 3D engravings or paint, largely produced in and imported from the metal and artisan-rich portions of the German Confederation, or made from paper, printed and imported from France, especially Strasbourg. And the image on the left of your screen is an example of those paper toy soldiers, the Petits Soldats de Strasbourg. Admittedly, this is an 1870 example. Those are the infantry de ligne of the Second French Empire. While some of these paper soldiers were pre-cut and colored in exquisite detail, most were sold in sheets, forcing the young would-be general to bring his regiments up to snuff with a pair of scissors, just as the juvenile theatrical entrepreneur did with his company. While the size of the figures may have varied, there was fundamentally very little difference between the serried ranks of paper soldiers marching out of Strasbourg and those produced by juvenile drama printers of London. Some of the more value-conscious French printers were even cramming figures onto the sheets at every angle to save space, much as their London theatrical counterparts were doing. Thanks to advances in materials and production techniques, flat metal and paper toy soldiers were more affordable in the 1830s and 40s than they had been when they were invented in the mid to late 18th century. But they were still imported, making sheets of soldiers printed in Britain a bargain, even if they were technically designed for the portion of the nursery floor that played a theatrical stage, rather than the portion that purported to be a battlefield. It is therefore quite likely that that the truncated version of Amherst's script that accompanied the juvenile drama version of the Battle of Waterloo was often cast aside, as the recipients of the sets abandoned his take on the battle and instead fought their own versions of Waterloo, Vittoria, Salamanca, and Talavera. That transference went both ways. In the early 1840s, 2 new editions of the juvenile drama adaptations of the Battle of Waterloo were published, one by John Kidby Green, an engraver's apprentice turned soldier turned juvenile drama impresario, and one by Skelt, a family of shoemakers who branched out into toy theater, clearly the logical progression of professions in that period. While both were clearly designed to be performed with just the characters and scenes that were included in the set, both offered the opportunity to make the battles even grander for a price. Right after the final curtain stage direction in Green's, the would-be director found the note, quote, "Green's various plates of miniature toy soldiers may be used in the Battle of Waterloo." Skelt was even more upfront. Directly after the list of characters were presented and the explanation of stage direction abbreviations on the first page was a, in full capitals, notice. Should you wish to include any more soldiers in this piece, they can be selected from the various sheets of Skelt's horse and foot soldiers. While it is possible that these sheets were manufactured as theatrical extras, it is in fact more likely that the printers of London, never slow to sense a business opportunity, had recognized the similarities between theatrical souvenir/juvenile drama character sheets and paper soldiers, and had expanded their offerings into sheets of soldiers explicitly sold for non-scripted, but often still regimented, if you'll forgive me the pun, play. The inclusion of the notes also illustrates that those who sold juvenile drama sets understood that their customers often went off book, using the plays as jumping off points to the wider stages of the imaginations. Much like how children of the 20th and 21st centuries have combined Lego kits to create grand designs, so the patrons of Greens and Skelts threw historical accuracy to the winds and placed Roman legions and charging knights under the command of Wellington and Napoleon in an eternal battle for supremacy. Now, everything so far discussed involves civilians in one aspect or another, playing soldiers, right? Whether it's children playing soldiers directly or adults in theatrical productions playing soldiers. But what about the army itself? They were, unsurprisingly, avid consumers of theatrical productions. We discussed military officers and veterans attending the Battle of Waterloo. And Charles Dickens, when still operating under his early pen name Boz, used a garrison trip to the theater to draw scathing comparisons between strutting, unbloody junior officers and grizzled veterans in his Sketches of Young Gentlemen. For actual cooperation between theatrical and military companies, however, one must look to the colonies. In 1842, the Royal Victoria Theatre in Launceston, Tasmania's second city north of Hobart, offered its patrons a stirring example of military-civilian artistic cooperation. Quote, "The grand military spectacle got up expressly for this occasion of the Battle of Waterloo." With the stage of the theatre cleared, the entire military garrison of Launceston passed over it in review, going through the manual and platoon exercise and executing several brilliant movements. Following this show of military force, the company engaged in a series of tableaux depicting the events of June 18, 1815. The performance was clearly inspired by the theatrical spectacles of London, and while London events might boast the Duke of Wellington and the Marquis of Anglesey among their patrons, Tasmania had some unexpected advantages. The more complicated politics of civilian-military interactions on home soil meant that there was no way Astley's, or its main rival Vauxhall, could secure the extensive participation of a serving regiment, instead having to rely on veterans to provide the correct military snap. In the colonies, however, the boost in confidence and pride provided by those serried ranks of young men, bedecked in scarlet cloth and shining steel, outweighed any questions of the inappropriateness of one of Her Majesty's regiments generating additional ticket sales for a private spectacle. The splendid attraction at the Royal Victoria Theatre, therefore, was a rarity. Sometimes regimental bands would be hired by theatrical productions, but more traditionally, the military and theatrical spheres operated as two separate circles, often cooperating, but only very rarely becoming a Venn diagram. The military remained avid consumers of theater, and while more work has to be done on this in the pre-20th century context, threw themselves into amateur dramatics with enthusiasm. Simultaneously, theatrical characters remained, military characters remained favorites of the theater-going public throughout. Although as the century advanced, they more often followed British literary tradition and placed their military men in civilian settings rather than on the field of battle. Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience, for example, featured the entire officers' mess of a regiment of heavy dragoons. But the soldiers of our Queen's fight was not with the enemies of the British Empire. It was instead with aesthetes and fops over the hearts of young women, as depicted in the images on your screen at this moment. And it is there that I will leave you for the evening. Thank you so much for listening, and I am more than happy to answer any questions.
Luke, can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Good. Can I just say, wow. So this is what I like so much about the Society's monthly talks. I was completely unaware of almost everything that you were talking about this evening. And I got my grandson here, and I can just see juvenile drama of that, and of course, so many of us at Christmas time might watch The Sound of Music, and you can remember the Von Trapp family playing with the scenery, etc. And those of my generation, and subsequently, I suppose, Airfix and Toy Soldiers and all the rest of it, I was completely unaware of juvenile drama, never heard of it. But what interested me even more was hippodrama. Now, can you expand on that a bit, please? Because was it a big thing in the early 19th century to put both horses and actors on the same stage?
It was actually. So it comes out of these bizarre theatrical laws of the time, right? So, and in the late 18th century, you have this weird system where only the theater royals could in fact do full, proper, legitimate 5-act theater, Shakespeare and the like. Others were licensed for different things: burletta, melodrama, spectacle. And one of those became about horses. It rose out of trick riding, it rose out of riding schools. And a lot of the people who started it were veterans. Astley himself was a veteran of the 7 Years' War. And it becomes more and more popular as this sort of combination of entertainments. And much as in, modern blockbusters use spectacle to draw in crowds, it became hugely popular. Now, you had to have special places to do it, right? You can't really put that many horses on a modern stage, although there are examples, obviously. Both the Royal Opera and the Met in New York have used animals on stage for massive set pieces. But hippodrama itself in these amphitheaters became massively popular. And it lends its name to the largest theaters of the 19th century, which are, of course, the London and New York hippodromes, where by that point it had become less dramatically driven and more series of almost circus shows.
Interesting, because I have never heard of it. I know the London Hippodrome, but I hadn't realised that that's where the word originates from. So when did it die out?
In its sort of theatrical version, it dies out in the late 19th century and is replaced by almost a vaudeville music hall version that involves like tricks with elephants that we would recognize as more circus. So the dramatic side ends there, but sort of continues in the traditions of circuses and the like.
Yeah, it's once again, I go back to the scholarship here, Luke, in terms of this is really interdisciplinary, isn't it? Because you can look at this from theatre studies. We're looking at it from a sort of a military history, but also in terms of the businesses you were talking about in terms of business history, how people made their living out of producing not only the scripts but all the paraphernalia that went with it. Have you got much interest from other disciplines in this, or is it just something that you're ploughing a lonely furrow at the moment?
There's a decent amount of it in theater history, looking at it there. And in fact, the work that this is drawing on is a collection of scripts of this hippodrama and all the toy theater versions. And that is currently under peer review at Manchester University Press. And I chose them, or I was recommended to go to them, because of that combination of their history list and their theater history list.
Right.
Sort of driving in there.
So this is a monogram you're producing, is it then?
It is, yes. Hopefully to be published in 2025.
Looking forward to it. Okay, enough from me. John's asked this question. Do any of the counts or bills you have about the Battle of Waterloo mention Jean-Pierre Genet? He and Ducrot are buried in Kensal Green Cemetery. One story is that Genet was a French cavalryman captured at Waterloo. I believe that this was the story made up by Ducrot to promote the production.
I have not encountered any direct mention of Genet. It's a name that I need to look at a little further to dig into deeper, and I thank you for that. I've no doubt that he was a part of the team, but he is not given named roles, at least that I've encountered yet in the ones that I've looked at. But that is definitely something worth a little bit more exploration.
Okay, great, thank you. Magnus has asked, what about the not infrequent mentions of Amdram in Peninsular memorialists?
Yeah, so I mentioned this briefly at the end, and it's something that needs to be looked at a little bit more. We have some work on it. There's some spectacular work actually on theatrical productions by French prisoners of war in England during the wars. But it's something that needs to be explored on the level of, there's multiple works looking at sort of Amdram among garrisons in World War II and afterwards. And someone needs to, and that someone may be me, we'll see, needs to do that on the Peninsular War and sort of dig into that a little further.
Okay, another thing that you mentioned, and Magnus once again has highlighted it, not something that I was aware of, this not being my period of history, the Cumberland Hussars. Magnus says they were notorious for cowardice in the face of the enemy. Now, had he not said that, and you went through it, I'd thought they were just one of these make-believe regiments like the Royal Wheeled Fusiliers or something. But who were the Cumberland Hussars?
The Cumberland Hussars, and honestly, there are probably people in the chat, including Magnus, who could give a more detailed answer to this than I can. But they were an amateur regiment, and they were one of those ones that were sort of like adventurers and things like that. And they were in theory in the order of battle at Waterloo, and were ordered to charge at one point. And basically, the response was, "No, we don't feel like it." Which is, yeah, a great way to earn your reputation.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Magnus also said horses appear in Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots. You're aware of that, right?
Yeah, horses are relatively common, and in fact, so at the end of the 1824 season, when the Battle of Waterloo closes, the company is sort of thrown to the winds. Some of them go to do other productions. Ducrot is actually hired by one of the legitimate theaters to try and bring a little bit of that hippodrama magic. And he's a little bit sort of limited. And so he eventually ends up actually leasing the amphitheater himself and becoming the sort of the way to do that instead, and go with that. But so there are absolutely examples of horses, camels, elephants. There are even mentions of ostriches, I believe, and a few others. My favorite comment actually that comes out of this is there's the old saw, right, among Hollywood actors that you should never work with animals or children. But a lot of the sort of writings that you get about the directors and the producers at this time basically say, honestly, the horses are easier to work with. All they want is a rub down, some hay and some oats at the end of the day. And if the actors could be satiated with that, I'd be in a lot, I'd have a lot fewer gray hairs.
Sorry, just for the benefit of the people who are watching this on recording, John's gone into a bit more explanation about Genet. Genet would have been about 17 at Waterloo. I think it's more likely that De Croo came across him whilst touring France in 1823, as he'd got a reputation for training farm animals. He certainly joined De Croo and went on to found his own circus dynasty. So this is, once again, what I love so much about these online talks. We have such a knowledgeable audience in here, which helps. I think we've run out of questions, Luke. But before I wind up, Andrew Banford has asked me to share with the audience the conference Land Forces of the Crown, which is being held in Leeds in February of next year. I've put a call to action up on the screen now. If you're not able to attend the conference live, and I'm fortunate it's not that far from me, so I can go. But if, like Luke, you find yourself on the other side of the North Atlantic and maybe can't attend in person, tickets are available for live streaming. And if you go to book a ticket there or go onto the Society's website, please join us in February for what I think is going to be a really fascinating series of talks. Not only the keynote speakers, but also I think there are 11 separate panels that are being run. And once again, it's one of the benefits of membership of the Society we get, being exposed to this level of scholarship.
Absolutely. I've seen at least some of the lineup and it's well worth it.
Thank you, Luke. That's great. What else to say other than thank you all for attending this year's online talks. We've now got a full program for next year, which is advertised on the Society's website, is trailed in the Society's newsletter, in the most recent posting of the journal that arrived with me this week. We've announced the next lineup of speakers. Once again, we never set a regular date for these. It's always once a month. It's always between Monday and a Thursday midweek. But we rely on the availability of our speakers and myself as the moderator before we set a date. So it only leaves me now this evening to, on behalf of the audience, Luke, to thank you for a fascinating talk this evening. Once again, shows the range of your scholarship, and we are most grateful. Have a very happy Christmas and New Year, and hopefully we'll all meet again in the new year.
I look forward to it. Thank you guys for attending, and thank you so much for having me again, and a very happy Christmas to everybody.
Cheers. Bye-bye, everybody.